Nice job. Nice job. I'll get to grips with the recordings. Thanks, Sabina. And lastly, we will be shining the spotlight on one of our experts. Today, it's Bill Wood, Casey, who will be finishing the session in absentia, but we'll show you a bit more about that in a moment. If you find the session useful, please do spread the love. Share it with your colleagues, anyone else that you think would find this session useful. That would be much appreciated. Now over to Sabina for some housekeeping, and then we'll get stuck in.
Thank you. I'm slightly concerned about the roles, the gender and the roles, but never mind. I'll take it for today, and we'll see what happens next time. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. I see Stephen shaking his head, dead right. Good to know I have some solidarity in the room. Very nice to see you all. Just in terms of the housekeeping, let's call it logistics, maybe. If you have any questions or comments or want to slag either of us off, please do so in the chat box. Just for time management purposes, and we'll get to as many of the questions and or insults as we can once we have covered the main portion of the session. And so without any further, that's I think as much housekeeping as needs to be done. Without any further ado, we're going to move on to our first section for today, which is a development in Irish law. Now, the Irish lawyers among you might be familiar with this, but there's also a kind of an international angle to this, because this long overdue, I think, overhaul of defamation law in Ireland is somewhat spurred, as many legislative initiatives are, by the EU and new EU provisions around certain aspects of defamation, particularly these wonderful things called SLAPs, which are strategic lawsuits against public participation. And I'm going to just make sure Alan is muted now for the next bit. So what we have here is, from our perspective as dispute resolution practitioners, I think an interesting signal of the government and the legislatures, particularly continued commitment to trying to divert appropriate cases into dispute resolution processes. What we have, just a little bit of context on this new bill, particularly for the non-Irish among you. So the new draft general scheme of the Defamation Amendment Bill, a bit of a mouthful, is taking the form of this sort of new approach, or new-ish approach to legislation, which we also saw in relation to the Mediation Act, where a report was published on reform of the law initially, which was based on an extensive review of the area and consultation with both stakeholders and particularly the general public. That report was published earlier in the year, and then this draft general scheme, which is like a draft effectively of a bill, but not in quite as much detail as a full draft bill will be, was published on the 28th of March and will now go to the relevant joint committee in the Oireachtas in the House of Parliament for pre-legislative scrutiny. The bill does a lot of different things and really is trying to drag defamation law into the 21st century by looking at things like defamation that happens online, these SLAPs that I've mentioned, and by sort of aligning Irish defamation law with other jurisdictions, particularly around jury trials and non-jury trials. So the motivation for this really, amongst other things, was First of all, to reduce the risk of unpredictable High Court awards, and I'm sure High Court judges will have a thing or two to say about that, but anyway, to reduce legal costs, which are often very high in defamation cases, to address the issue of online defamation and these strategic lawsuits against public participation, which is probably a subject for a whole other webinar, actually, and very importantly, to promote ADR. And it does the latter in a number of different ways. Number one, under Head 7, it obliges solicitors, and those of you who've read the Mediation Act, this will begin to sound a little familiar. It obliges solicitors in consultation with their clients to advise their clients or potential claimants on resolving the dispute by means other than a trial or other than a legal action. And specifically, there are some ADR mechanisms set up already under the existing legislative infrastructure for defamation, including the Press Council and something that's called, and you'll forgive me, I'm not a native Gaeilgeoir, but Comisiún na Mán, which is that has a right of reply scheme and various other ADR processes. Solicitor then has to swear a statutory declaration with the originating proceedings that they have done so. The second provision is under Head 8, it puts an obligation on the parties to consider using mediation. Okay. Then it at first instance, it looks like a bit of a toothless obligation just to say, oh, you know, you as parties had better consider mediation here. However, under Head 22, the court, in deciding on what factors might influence the awarding of costs in the action, and I quote, may, where it considers it just, have regard to any unreasonable refusal or failure by a party to the proceedings to consider using, or, as the case may be, attend alternative dispute resolution procedures, in particular mediation, the services of the Press Council, or the Comisiún na Mán right of reply scheme. Okay, so for those of you over in the UK, that sounds a little bit familiar. We've got unreasonable refusal. That has also made an appearance in our Mediation Act. So that is the back end of the obligation on participants or parties to these proceedings to consider mediation. Finally, in relation to online publications, there is something called a new process called a notice of complaint to an intermediary service provider, which incentivizes early resolution and an engagement, and puts this intermediary service provider, which can be the platform on which this is hosted, to engage with the parties early and try to rectify the situation before it ever gets to any of these processes. So what do we think about this? Well, on first glance, you can see that there is some very welcome, from my perspective, consistency here. Because for those of you that are familiar with the legislative landscape in Ireland more broadly in relation to ADR, a lot of the different bits of legislation outside the Mediation Act are not entirely consistent with it. This shows that whoever drafted this act did actually read the Mediation Act and has aligned the provisions with it in terms of the obligations on solicitors, the obligations on parties, and the potential cost penalties for unreasonable refusal to mediate. So it does show a certain trajectory, I think, in terms of how these kind of cases should be managed. It's also welcome development in the defamation area because, of course, it is a type of dispute that is, by definition, open to very strong emotions. Defamation actions can become very personal. The damage, if you like, that a defamation incidence of defamation can cause can be very significant in terms of reputation and finances. So the idea, number one, that these disputes be resolved early by ADR, and also that this has been recognized by those drafting the report into mediation, and by the stakeholders. And I've put up the link to both the general scheme and the report there. And you can, if you're interested, you can have a little bit more of a look into that. But there's certainly a recognition now that mediation and ADR processes are the way to go before issuing any proceedings. So for the solicitors in the audience, that's another nudge to have that conversation about mediation at the very first instance. And I noticed actually this week that one of the very well-known defamation solicitor, actually Simon McAleese, has been appointed to the Circuit Court. So there you go. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of cases he gets. So that is our little section on the law. As I say, any questions or comments on that, or if we have any defamational experts in the audience, feel free to put them into the chat box. And then I'm going to hand over to Aled, who is jumping into the practice end of things, but very much with the mind that as I was saying, these cases can be very emotive, okay? And how you deal with this, if, for example, you're a solicitor who has a client who feels they've been defamed, come into you, and now you have to divert them into an alternative dispute resolution procedure. So I'm going to hand over to Aled for that, with just a quick alert, Aled, that I'm having some difficulties with the poll function. So I'm going to get you to just jump over that for the moment, or we'll do quite an old-fashioned poll with raising of hands.
Old-fashioned polls are good. Thanks, Irina. Good to see a little bit of legislative joined-up thinking over in Ireland, and we'll watch this space. Excellent. Okay, so segueing onto, I mean, there were lots of heads, head 7, head 8, head 34. This is a different kind of head, the losing heads that sometimes we encounter in mediation, either as mediators. But I guess, and just this week I had someone in the office who was grappling with a very difficult employment dispute where there was a lot of emotion, and he was seeking some advice on specifically how to manage himself in the mediation. He was anxious about how he might respond. So this is very, very useful. When we encounter strong emotions, we all have a default, you know, our go-to reaction to strong emotions. And as I'm talking, if you could put in the chat box just a couple of words to encapsulate your default to when you encounter a strong emotion like anger. What's your initial reaction? Okay, don't worry. Just pop it in the chat box, and we'll pull those out. But generally speaking, our reactions to a strong emotional outburst, something like anger, for example, which is the the scariest one of the lot, I think, typically falls into 3 boxes. You know, we react defensively, which in one respect can be perceived as, you know, counter-offensively. We can be combative, so immediately, you know, jump back and attack. We can deflect or avoid. And those are typical sort of automatic, autopilot reactions to a strong emotion. And, you know, from that, you know, we have these strategies that just materialize. And more often than not, they're not particularly useful or effective. And the goal for us all is to increase our awareness and cultivate the skills to go from reacting to responding. Okay, so again, taking anger as an example of a strong emotional reaction. And the key to understanding anger is pretty simple, really. Nobody gets angry about something they don't care about. Okay, so you can infer from that that anger actually is about caring. So as an observer, whether you're a mediator, whether you're a lawyer, a parent, whatever the context, it's important that you try to understand what that person is trying to achieve through their anger, because anger is quite a superficial emotion, and it isn't really the deepest one. There are layers underneath that strong emotion. So moving on to the strategy for when you do encounter a strong emotion, and I think it's important to distinguish here. If you are, as a mediator, for example, when I encounter anger and the parties are angry at each other, I don't find it that challenging to manage those situations. If that anger is directed at me, I absolutely brick it. I have this moment of panic internally. And the first thing, the most important thing to remember is anger comes from your amygdala. Your strong emotional reaction comes from your amygdala, your emotional brain. So in that very moment, whatever you say, whatever comes out of your mouth is not going to be useful or helpful at all. And you'll all be familiar with, the calm down. That's never worked for anyone ever, I don't think. So on the slide, you'll see the first emoji, the inner smile. That's a sort of comes from a martial arts, Aikido, actually. And it's this idea that it's that sort of pause, that breath that you take, and inside that inner knowing of what to do next in the face of adversity. Okay, it's just a momentary pause to allow the red mist to descend so that you can then engage the other side's logical, rational brain. Okay, so there's a momentary pause, a breath, a chance to compose yourself before you move into this first stage in this strategy. And it's called the ECPC. Interestingly, this ECPC strategy comes from the world of sales. And it's a strategy that salespeople use to overcome objections. Okay. But interestingly, it's just really effective when it's done well, when it's done authentically, not as a moving through the motions. It's done really genuinely wanting to try and understand what the concerns, what the objections, what the worries are of that other person. So the first stage is empathy. I call it emergency first aid empathy. And that is, and again, it's kind of the difference between sort of sympathy and empathy. This is more sort of cognitive empathy, where you don't know how the other person's feeling, but you can imagine if you were in their shoes, how you might be feeling. You can relate to, at some level, the reason, the rational reaction that they're experiencing. But you never know how they're feeling. Okay, so you couldn't say something like, "Gosh, Sabina, I can see you're really angry when I talked about housekeeping," right? I turn that into a question. Sabina, you seem really, really pissed off that I've mentioned the housekeeping, and is that right? Now, Sabina could turn back to me and say, "You're dead right, absolutely," or "No, it's not that, it's something else." So you're always checking out an assumption. You're kind of, and part of your role, you've got all this data coming at you. So you're constantly generating hypotheses to test out. Okay, so you seem really angry about what was said by Bob in that moment. Am I right? Yeah, absolutely. I'm fuming. Great. Okay, time to move to second base. Clarify. Could you help me understand why this matters so much to you. Help me understand, what you care so much about this issue, or why you care so much about this issue, on the assumption that anger is just the superficial emotion. There's something deeper. Anger is, no one gets angry about something they don't care about. So you're trying to burrow underneath that initial explosion, and you're clarifying. Help me understand. You're wanting more information. You help me understand what's important to you about this, or why that word or that reaction caused you so much anger, frustration. And then you sit back and you use these and you just listen, okay, and see what comes out. When you have enough information, enough data that you think, actually now I think I can propose a way forward, you move to the next space. Okay, that's really helpful. I'm going to propose something that we do here. I think perhaps if we went for a walk, took a break, if we spent a little bit of time exploring this issue, whatever it is, whatever the proposition that you want to put forward, express it. What's your reaction to that? And just wait and see what happens. Okay, and then you're kind of checking back. Then you're moving to the last space. If we did that, would that satisfy your concern? Would that meet your need? And if they say no, then you need to go back and get a little bit more information. So you go back to the clarify stage. Okay, could you say a little bit more about why that wouldn't work for you? Help me understand what would work for you. So the ECPC is a really useful strategy. It's good to have a tool that you can use to help respond to an explosion, a difficult or a challenging situation in a productive, useful way that helps move the conversation forward, rather than react defensively, aggressively, unintentionally, by the way. But if we're reacting from an emotional standpoint, we tend not. It's all happening unconsciously, automatically, on autopilot. So this is the ECPC method. It comes from sales. It was used as objection handling, but really successfully. And we've adapted it slightly to use it in a mediation or another context. I would, first of all, test it out with your significant other before you try it in real life, maybe with your kids, maybe with a member of the public, and then when you're ready, with your clients and in a mediation.
I don't know. I think I'd go the other way around. I'd feel infinitely safer testing it with somebody in a mediation than with my teenage kids. But we'll see about that. But joking apart, it's really effective, and even the inner smile piece, which sounds a little bit fluffy, but actually when you're in a situation, and it can be something as basic as, an interaction you have with somebody in the supermarket, but if you take that minute to sort of reorientate yourself rather than just reacting, it can mean the difference between just an ordinary interaction and one that escalates and has you fuming for the rest of the day. So taking this idea and kind of going the next step with it, we're looking at dealing with outbursts in mediation. And I know when we're training mediators and lawyers, even in relation to managing clients and managing conflict and that, and people are often afraid of, what happens if the parties kick off? There's a lot of discussion about, I don't want to have a joint session in case the parties kick off. But if you have tools like this, and if you actually change your whole approach and thinking about the parties kicking off, then that can give you a way of managing it. And to talk a little bit more about this, we'll hand over to one of the greats, one of the most experienced mediators out there, and what he does if there's a bombshell dropped or something erupts in a process that is unexpected and that is going to trigger some high emotion. So this is how Bill Wood, KC, views a situation like that. Wrote it there.
Direction. What I don't want is parties meeting calmly at the beginning, like they're about to play a round of golf together, and going into their separate rooms, and it's all lovely, level, very unemotional. We're just here to do business, Bill, and all the rest of it. I've got no energy to work with in those kind of cases. So somebody says in the opening session, by the way, you need to know we're bankrupt next Wednesday, whether we settle this case or not. So, whistle for your money or something, or whatever it may be. As long as it's true, then it's important everybody knows it, and we all have to adapt. But it just, it's that kind of thing that sort of validates the process.
Yeah. What about the sort of bombshells where somebody says, you have to settle this, or this will happen, or I will do this, or I will reveal this, or, kind of, I suppose, threats, if you like.
Well, that the other side will say, well, that's blackmail. So, you've just committed a criminal offence. I mean, you then get all that kind of discussion, but it's fed into the process. If you say, I realise I have a statutory duty to tell the regulator about what you were doing, but I won't if you pay me lots of money, that's probably blackmail. If you say to somebody, this trial is going to be in public, so it will be available to the press that you did such and such, which is, of course, in breach of your regulatory obligations, then that's somehow less threatening and so on. But the allegation that it's blackmail will still be made in return. And the other party will invariably say, we are a banker, an estate agent, a lawyer. We have no reputation to lose because we're all so trashed so regularly in the press. So go do your worst. That's always the reply. Again, always untrue, because actually reputation is hugely important, but nobody will ever admit it. So many of these cases.
Yeah.
There's a few words of wisdom from the wonderful Bill. So, to summarize what he's saying there is basic. First of all, he says this anger is an energy, and that's great, because as Alan was saying, people don't get angry about things that aren't important to them. So if people are getting angry or starting to make threats, you're getting to the heart of the issue, and everything can go on the table initially. Let it all out there. Don't pretend that you're going to play a round of golf. Let it all out there. And then you work with it. What's a fact? What's a threat? What's an opinion? There are different ways of managing all these things. And I think the lesson for us as mediators and as lawyers is not to be afraid of these things. Just work with what's on the table in front of you. And his little vignette about reputation, whatever he might think about solicitors and estate agents' reputations, is there's always interests underlying the anger and underlying the high emotion. So coming right back around to defamation at the beginning, if somebody comes in to you and they're really upset because they've just read an article or a tweet that has said that they've done this and this and this, they're angry, they want to sue the other person, they want to threaten the other person, they want to take them for everything they've got. But what's under that, of course, is fear around loss of reputation, the damage that's been done, the personal damage that's been done. And as mediators and as lawyers, having those initial conversations, that's what we need to focus on, rather than saying, calm down now, let's talk through this rationally, because that just won't work.
Thanks, we've got time for one question. Actually, we've got one question in the box. Thanks everyone, by the way, for your responses to the manual poll. We've got a few interesting reactions, like staying calm, be more reflective, avoiding. Yes, I can relate to that. Measured, definitely. But a question from Stephen Walker: how often do defamation cases go to mediation?
If only there were statistics, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Impossible to know, of course, because there's no mechanism for reporting where cases go. I mean, you hear plenty about the cases that go to the High Court and in the past went to jury trials in the High Court, but you don't hear about the ones that are settled at mediation. Now, unless I can defer to any of my solicitor colleagues who have personal expression, one, of course, the big, and if there's any potential students or PhD students out there, one of the big gaps in mediation is actual statistical research on what cases, where cases end up and how many cases actually go to mediation. So I'm afraid that's a very elaborate way of saying I have no idea, Stephen, unfortunately.
Great. Thanks very much, Sabina. Okay, we've got to wrap up here. Thank you, everyone. We hope you found it useful. There's a couple of requests we have. If you want to find out a little bit more about mediation, mediation tools, tips, techniques, stories, memes, we've launched a newsletter, and you can sign up to get the newsletter. Go to mediateacademy.com and a little pop-up, and just pop your email address in there, and you'll get a newsletter once a month on a Saturday morning to drink with your cup of coffee. Spread the love. Please do tell your friends, colleagues how wonderful or rubbish this session was, and hopefully they will either avoid it like the plague or maybe join us next month, May the 30th, Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. for that next caffeine injection. One other thing, we have our next commercial mediation training in Dublin, May the 3rd. We've got a seat available for that. So if you are interested, do drop me an email at alid@mediatoracademy.com, because we're very keen to complete the enrollment for that program. So we're offering a very generous discount to one lucky individual. So if that's you and you want to find out a bit more about the program, drop me an email and I'll get back to you with more information. That's it. Have an awesome day, an awesome week, and we'll see you next month. Thank you very much.
Enjoy the sunshine if there is some.